In the autumn of 1847, construction workers breaking ground for a new railway line through the hills of eastern Pennsylvania made a discovery that would haunt the region for generations. Beneath what appeared to be an ordinary family cemetery, their shovels struck something that should never have been there: a network of crude wooden boxes, stacked in layers, containing human remains that bore unmistakable signs of systematic butchery. The Pennsylvania State Railroad Commission immediately sealed the site and placed armed guards around the perimeter. What they found in those boxes, and in the detailed ledgers discovered in a nearby farmhouse cellar, revealed a commercial enterprise so methodical and so vast in its scope that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend its full magnitude. Between 1823 and 1846, over 400 people had simply vanished from the roads that wound through Grayson Hollow. Travelers, immigrants seeking passage west, entire families moving toward promises of new land and opportunity had entered that verdant valley and never emerged. For nearly a quarter century, the local authorities had attributed these disappearances to the natural hazards of frontier life: wild animals, harsh weather, bandits, the countless perils that claimed lives on America's expanding frontier. What the railroad workers had uncovered beneath that peaceful cemetery told a far more sinister story. The Grayson family had operated what can only be described as a human processing facility. Their ledgers, written in Ezekiel Grayson's meticulous hand, documented each victim with the cold precision of a livestock trader. Names, ages, physical descriptions, estimated weights, and most chillingly, projected market values for various body parts. The entries revealed a sophisticated understanding of anatomy and an extensive network of buyers throughout the eastern United States. Medical colleges in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston had unknowingly purchased human specimens from the Grayson operation, believing they were dealing with legitimate resurrection men who supplied cadavers for educational purposes. Before we descend deeper into this tale of systematic horror, understand that this story isn't for everyone. Only those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of American history should continue listening. If you're ready to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these buried horrors remain forgotten, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We're building a global community of people who believe these stories must be told, no matter how disturbing they may be. Ezekiel Grayson had arrived in Pennsylvania in 1821. Presenting himself as a God-fearing Methodist minister seeking to establish a congregation in the sparsely populated valley that would eventually bear his family name. He traveled with his wife Martha, a woman whose medical knowledge was remarkable for someone without formal training, and their 3 children, Samuel, aged 16, Rebecca, 14, and young Thomas, barely 12 years old. The family appeared to embody the pioneering spirit that was transforming America in those days. They built a modest church, established a small cemetery on a hill overlooking their property, and opened their home to travelers seeking shelter on the dangerous roads leading west. The Graysons quickly earned a reputation for Christian hospitality. Ezekiel's sermons drew settlers from miles around, and Martha's skill in treating injuries and illnesses made her invaluable to a community far from professional medical care. Their children were described by neighbors as well-mannered and devout, always ready to help with the countless tasks required to maintain their father's mission. Samuel showed particular promise as a scholar, spending hours studying his father's collection of medical and theological texts. Rebecca demonstrated an almost preternatural ability to calm frightened animals and soothe distressed travelers. Young Thomas, though small for his age, possessed an unsettling maturity that impressed adults and made other children slightly uncomfortable in his presence. What the community didn't realize was that the Grayson family was conducting what would now be recognized as a comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation. Every conversation with travelers, every story shared over Martha's dinner table, every detail about her visitor's destination, companions, and expected arrival times was carefully recorded in Ezekiel's private journals. The family developed an uncanny ability to identify the most vulnerable travelers, those traveling alone, those carrying significant wealth, those whose disappearance would be unlikely to trigger immediate investigation. The Grayson method was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its effectiveness. travelers would arrive at the family homestead seeking shelter, food, or directions. The Graysons would welcome them with apparent warmth, offering comfortable accommodations in their well-appointed guest quarters. Martha would prepare elaborate meals, and Ezekiel would regale visitors with stories of the region while subtly extracting information about their backgrounds, destinations, and whether anyone was expecting their arrival. If the family determined that a visitor met their criteria for selection, that person would never leave Grayson Hollow alive. The process typically began with Martha's special evening tea, a blend of herbs that included carefully measured doses of laudanum and other sedatives. Victims would gradually lose consciousness, believing they were simply succumbing to the natural fatigue of travel. They would awaken, if they awakened at all, in the stone-walled cellar beneath the Grayson home, where the family's true work began. The cellar had been modified with drainage systems, specialized tables, and an array of medical instruments that would have impressed surgeons in the finest hospitals of the day. What happened in that cellar defied every principle of Christian mercy that Ezekiel preached from his pulpit each Sunday morning. The Grayson family had developed a systematic approach to human dissection that maximized the commercial value of their victims while ensuring that evidence of their crimes would never be discovered. They had customers throughout the eastern seaboard, medical colleges that paid premium prices for fresh specimens, private collectors who valued exotic anatomical curiosities, and even a network of artists who required detailed knowledge of human musculature and bone structure for their work. The Grayson family's integration into the Pennsylvania frontier community was nothing short of masterful. Within 2 years of their arrival, Ezekiel had established himself as an indispensable pillar of local society. His Sunday sermons drew congregations from settlements 20 miles away, and his willingness to perform marriages, baptisms, and funeral services made him the de facto spiritual leader for hundreds of scattered families. Martha's reputation as a healer grew with each passing season, and desperate parents would travel for days to seek her help for sick children or difficult births. But it was the family's apparent prosperity that truly cemented their standing in the community. While other settlers struggled with crop failures and harsh winters, the Graysons seemed blessed with unusual good fortune. Their livestock was always well fed, their root cellar always full, and they consistently had silver coins to spend at the general store in nearby Millfield. When curious neighbors asked about their success, Ezekiel would smile and attribute it to divine providence and Martha's skill at trading herbal remedies with travelers passing through their remote valley. The children played their roles with disturbing perfection. Samuel had grown into a young man of impressive bearing, well-read and articulate, often assisting his father with church services and community meetings. He displayed a particular talent for befriending young male travelers, engaging them in conversations about their journeys and dreams while subtly gathering intelligence for his father's darker purposes. Rebecca had blossomed into a beautiful young woman whose gentle manner and healing touch made her beloved by every family in the valley. She had an uncanny ability to gain the trust of female travelers, often sitting with them for hours, listening to their stories and offering comfort that masked her true intentions. Young Thomas, now approaching his 16th birthday, had developed into perhaps the most unsettling member of the family. His small stature and boyish appearance allowed him to move through the community largely unnoticed, but those who observed him carefully noted an intensity in his pale blue eyes that seemed far too mature for his years. Thomas had become the family's scout, often disappearing for days at a time to observe traffic on the various roads leading into Grayson Hollow. He could predict with remarkable accuracy which travelers would be worth the family's attention and which should be allowed to pass through unmolested. The Graysons had established what modern investigators would recognize as a sophisticated victim selection process. They targeted individuals and families who met specific criteria: travelers with no fixed destination, immigrants who spoke little English, people carrying obvious wealth but lacking powerful connections, and most cynically, families with young children who could be sold separately to buyers with particularly aberrant needs. The family maintained detailed records of regional travel patterns, noting seasonal variations in traffic and identifying the most opportune times to strike without raising suspicion. Their operation had evolved far beyond simple murder for profit. The Graysons had developed a complex network of accomplices and customers that stretched from the medical colleges of Boston to the private laboratories of wealthy collectors in Charleston. They maintained correspondence with anatomists, physicians, and researchers who required human specimens for their work, carefully cultivating relationships that would ensure steady demand for their gruesome products. Martha had taught herself advanced preservation techniques, allowing the family to maintain inventory during slow periods and fulfill large orders when opportunities arose. If you're still with us as we uncover the depths of the Grayson family's depravity, you're part of a special community of people who understand that history's darkest chapters must be examined, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. Take a moment to let us know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. We have viewers from every continent following these investigations into America's buried secrets, and your participation helps us build a global network of truth seekers who refuse to let these stories remain hidden. The family's success depended on their ability to maintain their facade of respectability while operating what amounted to a commercial slaughterhouse in their basement. They had converted their cellar into a facility that would have impressed medical professionals of the era, complete with specialized drainage systems, temperature controls, and preservation equipment. The stone walls were lined with shelves containing an extensive collection of surgical instruments, chemical preservatives, and carefully labeled containers for storing different types of human tissue. Martha's medical knowledge had progressed far beyond what any frontier woman should possess. She had somehow acquired textbooks used in the finest medical colleges, surgical manuals that detailed the most advanced techniques of the day, and anatomical charts that mapped the human body with scientific precision. Her skill at human dissection rivaled that of trained surgeons, and her understanding of preservation chemistry allowed the family to maintain product quality that commanded premium prices from their discriminating clientele. The psychological dynamics within the Grayson household during this period reveal a family that had descended into complete moral corruption while maintaining the appearance of Christian virtue. Ezekiel had rationalized their activities as a form of divine calling, convincing himself and his family that they were providing a valuable service to the advancement of medical knowledge. Martha seemed to view their victims as raw materials rather than human beings, approaching each murder with the detached professionalism of a craftsman perfecting their trade. By the winter of 1826, the Grayson family had refined their methods to a level of efficiency that would have impressed the most ruthless commercial enterprises of their era. Their first confirmed victims had been a German immigrant family named the Webers, who had stopped at the Grayson homestead in late 1823 seeking directions to Lancaster County. Heinrich Weber, his pregnant wife Greta, and their 2 young sons had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their wagon and horses, which the Graysons claimed had been abandoned after the family decided to continue their journey on foot. The Weber case established the template that would guide the family's operations for the next 2 decades. Ezekiel had carefully studied the family's circumstances before making his decision to proceed. The Webers spoke limited English, carried a substantial amount of gold coin sewn into their clothing, and most importantly, had told no one in their previous stopping point about their intention to visit the Grayson homestead. They represented what the family would come to call a perfect opportunity, maximum profit with minimal risk of discovery. Martha's role in the Weber murders revealed the depth of her transformation from frontier healer to methodical killer. She had prepared her special tea blend with unusual care that evening, adjusting the dosage to account for the different body weights of her intended victims. The adults succumbed to the sedatives within an hour of their evening meal, while the children required smaller doses that rendered them unconscious but kept them alive for the more specialized aspects of the family's operation. The processing of the Weber family marked the beginning of the Graysons' reputation among their network of customers. Heinrich and Greta's bodies were systematically dismantled according to the specific requirements of various buyers. The Pennsylvania Medical College in Philadelphia received Heinrich's skeletal system, carefully cleaned and articulated for anatomical study. A private collector in New York purchased Greta's preserved organs, which Martha had prepared using advanced embalming techniques she had learned from correspondence with European anatomists. The fate of the Weber children demonstrated the family's willingness to exploit even the most vulnerable victims for profit. The elder boy, Franz, aged 8, was sold to a private buyer whose identity remained encrypted in Ezekiel's coded ledgers. The younger child, Klaus, barely 4 years old, was shipped to a medical facility in Boston that conducted research into childhood development and anatomy. The clinical language of the family's records regarding these transactions reveals a complete absence of human empathy or moral consideration. Samuel Grayson's evolution during this period shows how the family's criminal enterprise corrupted even its youngest members. Now 21 years old, Samuel had developed into the family's primary liaison with their customer network. He traveled regularly to Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, presenting himself as a legitimate supplier of anatomical specimens while negotiating contracts for future deliveries. His education and refined manner made him the perfect ambassador for the family's gruesome business, and his success in expanding their market reach contributed significantly to their growing prosperity. Rebecca had assumed responsibility for what the family euphemistically called guest relations. Her beauty and apparent innocence made her extraordinarily effective at gaining the trust of female travelers, particularly those traveling with children. She would spend hours listening to their stories, offering sympathy and comfort while mentally cataloging details that would help her family determine each visitor's commercial value. Her ability to maintain warmth and compassion while planning murder revealed a psychological corruption that disturbed even her own family members. Thomas, now 18, had become the family's most ruthless member. His responsibilities included the initial subduing of victims who proved resistant to Martha's sedatives, the physical aspects of moving unconscious victims to the cellar facility, and the grim task of disposing of evidence that could not be sold. His small stature concealed surprising physical strength, and his boyish appearance continued to make him nearly invisible to potential witnesses who might observe the family's activities. The Graysons had established a seasonal rhythm to their operations that maximized both profit and security. Spring and fall represented peak hunting seasons, when increased travel on frontier roads provided the greatest selection of potential victims. Summer operations focused primarily on lone travelers and small groups who could be processed quickly before the busy autumn harvest season. Winter murders were reserved for the most valuable targets, as the frozen ground made body disposal more challenging but also reduced the likelihood of accidental discovery. Their victim selection had become increasingly sophisticated, incorporating factors that modern criminal profilers would recognize as remarkably advanced for the 1820s. The family evaluated each potential target based on estimated wealth, likelihood of being missed, physical condition that would affect specimen quality, and market demand for specific types of anatomical material. They maintained detailed records of customer preferences, noting which buyers preferred male or female specimens, specific age ranges, and particular anatomical features that commanded premium prices. The psychological dynamics within the Grayson household during this period reveal a family that had created its own moral universe, completely disconnected from conventional human values. They discussed their victims using the same language that legitimate merchants might use to describe livestock or other commodities. Family dinner conversations included casual references to processing schedules, customer delivery requirements, and market conditions for human remains. The children had been raised to view murder as simply another aspect of the family business, no different from farming or any other commercial enterprise. The years between 1827 and 1832 marked what investigators would later identify as the Grayson family's period of systematic refinement. Having established their basic operational framework with the Weber murders, they began developing increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying, capturing, and processing victims while maintaining their facade of Christian respectability. Their success during this period was measured not only in the growing number of disappearances but in their ability to expand their customer base and increase the profitability of each transaction. Ezekiel had begun categorizing potential victims according to what he called harvest classifications. Category 1 targets were healthy adults between 20 and 40 years of age, whose bodies would yield the highest quality specimens for medical colleges and private anatomists. Category 2 consisted of children and elderly individuals whose remains served specialized research purposes or collectors with particular interests. Category 3 included pregnant women and individuals with unusual physical characteristics that commanded premium prices from buyers seeking rare anatomical specimens. The family had developed an elaborate system for monitoring regional travel patterns that would have impressed military intelligence officers of the era. Thomas had established observation posts at key locations throughout the valley, allowing him to track the movement of travelers days before they reached the Grayson homestead. He maintained detailed logs of traffic patterns, noting seasonal variations, weather conditions that affected travel, and the typical demographic characteristics of people using different routes through the region. Martha's medical expertise had evolved to include sophisticated knowledge of human anatomy that rivaled formerly trained physicians. She had acquired an extensive library of medical texts through correspondence with booksellers in major cities, claiming to be purchasing materials for her husband's theological research. Her understanding of preservation chemistry had progressed to the point where she could maintain specimen quality for months, allowing the family to fulfill large orders and take advantage of seasonal price fluctuations in the anatomical specimen market. The processing facility in the Grayson cellar had been expanded and upgraded with equipment that transformed it into what amounted to a commercial-grade human butchery operation. Martha had designed specialized tables with integrated drainage systems that prevented contamination and facilitated the efficient collection of blood and other fluids that had commercial value. The stone walls were lined with shelves containing hundreds of glass containers, metal instruments, and chemical preservatives organized with the precision of a medical laboratory. Samuel's role as the family's business representative had expanded to include cultivating relationships with corrupt officials who could provide advance warning of investigations or potential interference with their operations. He had developed contacts within local law enforcement, county government, and even the Pennsylvania state legislature who were willing to overlook suspicious activities in exchange for regular payments. These relationships proved invaluable when occasional inquiries arose about missing travelers or unexplained disappearances in the Grayson Hollow region. Rebecca had perfected what the family called the Comfort Protocol, a systematic approach to gaining the complete trust of female victims before their murders. She would spend hours with targeted women, sharing stories about her own supposed hardships and dreams for the future while gradually extracting detailed information about their backgrounds, destinations, and whether anyone was expecting their arrival. Her ability to project genuine warmth and empathy while planning cold-blooded murder demonstrated a level of psychological manipulation that disturbed even her criminally minded family members. The family had established quality control standards that ensured their products met the exacting requirements of their most demanding customers. Each specimen was carefully prepared according to specific preservation techniques, labeled with detailed anatomical information, and packaged in custom containers designed to prevent damage during shipping. They maintained detailed records of customer preferences, noting which buyers preferred specimens prepared using particular methods or preserved with specific chemical treatments. Their victim selection criteria had become increasingly refined, incorporating factors that maximized both profit and operational security. The Graysons preferred targets who traveled alone or in small groups, carried significant wealth but lacked powerful political connections, and most importantly, whose disappearance would be unlikely to trigger immediate investigation by competent authorities. They had developed an almost supernatural ability to identify travelers who met these criteria within minutes of their arrival at the homestead. The psychological evolution of the Grayson children during this period reveals the profound impact of being raised within a family enterprise built on systematic murder. Samuel, now in his mid-20s, had begun displaying signs of what modern psychologists would recognize as complete moral dissociation. He could negotiate the sale of human remains with the same emotional detachment that other men might bring to trading livestock or agricultural products. His correspondence with customers was filled with businesslike discussions of delivery schedules, quality guarantees, and customer satisfaction that completely ignored the human cost of their operations. Rebecca's transformation was perhaps even more disturbing than her brother's. Her natural empathy and nurturing instincts had been weaponized into tools for identifying and manipulating victims. She had learned to mimic genuine human emotion so convincingly that even experienced travelers who might normally be suspicious of strangers found themselves completely trusting her within hours of their first meeting. The contrast between her public persona as a devout Christian woman and her private role as a predator who specialized in gaining the trust of vulnerable women represents one of the most chilling aspects of the entire Grayson operation. Thomas had developed into what can only be described as the family's enforcement specialist. His responsibilities included subduing victims who proved resistant to sedation, managing the physical aspects of their processing operation, and eliminating evidence that could not be converted into profitable products. Despite his continued small stature, he had acquired combat skills that allowed him to overpower much larger opponents, and his boyish appearance continued to make him nearly invisible to potential witnesses who might observe suspicious activities around the family homestead. The period from 1833 to 1838 represented the peak of the Grayson family's horrific enterprise. During these 5 years, their operation expanded from a localized family business into what modern investigators would recognize as a sophisticated criminal organization with tentacles reaching into major cities throughout the eastern United States. The family's annual income during this period exceeded that of the wealthiest merchants in Philadelphia, and their influence had grown to include corrupt officials at the highest levels of Pennsylvania state government. Ezekiel had established what he called regional collection networks, essentially franchising his murder methods to carefully selected accomplices in other parts of Pennsylvania and neighboring states. These satellite operations were managed by individuals who had demonstrated both the moral flexibility necessary for systematic killing and the business acumen required to maintain profitable operations while avoiding detection. Each network paid the Graysons a percentage of their profits in exchange for access to customer lists, preservation techniques, and protective relationships with corrupt officials. The expansion had been facilitated by Samuel's increasing prominence in what passed for legitimate anatomical specimen trading. He had established himself as a respected supplier to medical colleges throughout the Northeast, and his reputation for providing high-quality specimens had made him a trusted vendor among professors and researchers who never questioned the source of his remarkably fresh materials. His business relationships provided perfect cover for the family's expanding network of murder operations. Martha's role had evolved beyond direct participation in killings to include training other women who would serve as the nurturing face of satellite operations. She had developed comprehensive instruction manuals that detailed every aspect of victim identification, sedation techniques, and specimen preparation methods. Her students were typically the wives or daughters of men recruited by Samuel, and her ability to transform ordinary frontier women into efficient killers demonstrated the systematic nature of the family's approach to expanding their criminal enterprise. The Grayson homestead had been extensively modified to accommodate their increased operations. The original cellar facility had been expanded into a complex network of underground chambers that included specialized areas for different aspects of their processing work. One chamber was dedicated to initial victim preparation and sedation, another housed the actual dismemberment and preservation operations, and a third served as a storage facility for completed specimens awaiting shipment to customers. Rebecca had assumed responsibility for training young women recruited from their satellite operations in what the family called guest relations protocols. Her students learned to project warmth and trustworthiness while systematically gathering intelligence about potential victims. The training program included detailed instruction in reading social cues, identifying vulnerable travelers, and maintaining emotional detachment while planning murders. Rebecca's ability to teach these skills revealed the depth of her own psychological corruption and her complete disconnection from normal human empathy. Thomas had been assigned to manage the family's security operations, which had become increasingly complex as their network expanded. He maintained surveillance on local law enforcement activities, coordinated with corrupt officials who provided advance warning of potential investigations, and when necessary, eliminated individuals who posed threats to the family's operations. His work during this period included at least 12 murders that were unrelated to the family's specimen trade, victims killed solely because they had acquired dangerous knowledge about Grayson activities. If you're finding this deep dive into America's hidden criminal history as fascinating as it is disturbing, you're exactly the kind of person we create this content for. Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories that mainstream media would never dare to tell. Hit that like button to support our work uncovering these buried chapters of American history, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our investigations into the darkest corners of our past. The family's customer base had expanded to include buyers whose interests went far beyond legitimate medical research. Private collectors throughout Europe had begun purchasing specialized specimens through intermediaries who never revealed their ultimate destination. Some of these orders included requests for anatomical preparations that served no conceivable scientific purpose, suggesting that the Graysons were supplying materials for purposes that even they preferred not to investigate too closely. The victim processing protocols had been refined to maximize the commercial value of each murder while minimizing waste and disposal problems. Martha had developed techniques for utilizing virtually every part of the human body, from obvious specimens like skeletal systems and preserved organs to more unusual products like processed blood, hair, and even ground bone meal that was sold to buyers who claimed it had medicinal properties. The family's ledgers from this period show profit margins that would have impressed the most successful commercial enterprises of their era. Quality control had become a critical aspect of their operations as competition increased from other suppliers entering the anatomical specimen market. The Graysons maintained their premium pricing by ensuring that their products consistently exceeded customer expectations for freshness, preparation quality, and anatomical accuracy. They had developed standardized procedures for every aspect of specimen preparation, and each satellite operation was required to meet strict quality standards or face termination of their relationship with the Grayson network. The psychological dynamics within the family during this period reveal individuals who had completely severed any connection to normal human morality. Their dinner conversations included casual discussions of processing schedules, customer delivery requirements, and market conditions for human remains as if they were discussing wheat prices or livestock values. The children had been so thoroughly indoctrinated into viewing murder as a legitimate business activity that they displayed no emotional response to the suffering of their victims beyond concern for maintaining product quality. Regional law enforcement's complete failure to investigate the mounting evidence of systematic disappearances in areas controlled by the Grayson network demonstrates the extent of official corruption that enabled their operations. County sheriffs, state investigators, and even federal marshals had been compromised through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and strategic elimination of individuals who proved resistant to corruption. The family's protection network had become so comprehensive that they operated with virtual impunity throughout much of eastern Pennsylvania. The autumn of 1839 brought the first serious threat to the Grayson family's criminal empire when a traveling Methodist circuit rider named Reverend Joshua Whitman arrived at their homestead under circumstances that immediately triggered their security protocols. Whitman claimed to be seeking shelter while traveling to a church conference in Lancaster, but Thomas's surveillance network had detected inconsistencies in his story that suggested he might be conducting some form of investigation into the unusual number of disappearances in the region. Unlike typical travelers who arrived at the Grayson homestead exhausted and grateful for hospitality, Whitman displayed an alertness and attention to detail that made the family deeply uncomfortable. He asked pointed questions about local travel patterns, inquired about other recent visitors to the area, and most troubling, demonstrated knowledge of specific individuals who had vanished while passing through Grayson Hollow. His manner suggested someone gathering intelligence rather than a simple traveler seeking directions and shelter. Ezekiel's decision to eliminate Whitman despite the elevated risk demonstrated how the family's success had bred dangerous overconfidence. The circuit rider was a well-known figure throughout Pennsylvania, with established relationships at churches across multiple counties. His disappearance would inevitably trigger inquiries from religious authorities who possessed both the motivation and resources to conduct thorough investigations. Samuel argued strongly against proceeding with the murder, warning that killing Whitman could expose their entire operation to scrutiny they had successfully avoided for nearly 2 decades. The family's internal debate over the Whitman situation revealed growing tensions that threatened their unity and operational security. Martha supported Ezekiel's determination to eliminate the circuit rider, arguing that allowing a potential investigator to leave their territory alive represented an unacceptable risk to their enterprise. Rebecca expressed concerns about the spiritual implications of murdering a man of God, the first time she had displayed any moral qualms about their activities since childhood. Thomas characteristically favored the most aggressive approach, suggesting they should not only kill Whitman but stage his death to appear accidental. The murder of Reverend Whitman marked a turning point in the family's operational methods, forcing them to implement security measures that would fundamentally change their approach to victim selection and processing. They could no longer rely solely on the isolated location of their homestead and the corruption of local officials to protect them from investigation. The circuit rider's death would require careful management of evidence, witness elimination, and potentially the temporary suspension of their operations until the resulting inquiries could be contained. Martha's preparation of Whitman for sedation required unusual care due to his obvious suspicion of their intentions. She was forced to use more subtle delivery methods for her drug cocktail, incorporating the sedatives into food and drink that would not arouse suspicion from someone already wary of their hospitality. The process took nearly 3 days, during which the family maintained their facade of Christian fellowship while carefully monitoring their guest for signs that he had communicated his location to outside contacts. The processing of Whitman's body presented unique challenges that forced the family to modify their standard procedures. As a circuit rider, he carried official church documents that required careful handling to avoid triggering immediate investigation. His personal effects included correspondence that revealed extensive connections throughout Pennsylvania's religious community, information that the family needed to analyze carefully to understand the scope of potential threats to their security. Samuel's role in managing the aftermath of the Whitman murder demonstrated the family's ability to adapt their methods when faced with exceptional circumstances. He traveled immediately to Philadelphia to meet with corrupt officials who could help suppress inquiries about the circuit rider's disappearance. These conversations required delicate negotiation, as church authorities possessed moral authority that made them more difficult to intimidate or bribe than typical law enforcement officials. The family's satellite operations were placed on emergency protocols following the Whitman incident, with all non-essential activities suspended until the security situation could be assessed. Regional network managers received coded communications instructing them to avoid high-risk targets and focus exclusively on victims whose disappearance would be unlikely to trigger organized investigation. This period of reduced activity cost the organization significant profits but prevented the exposure that could have destroyed their entire enterprise. Thomas's investigation into Whitman's background revealed connections that validated the family's concerns about his true purpose in visiting their territory. The circuit rider had been corresponding with families of missing travelers, collecting information about disappearances that occurred in areas controlled by the Grayson Network. His personal journals, discovered among his effects, contained detailed notes about travel patterns, victim demographics, and suspicious circumstances surrounding multiple disappearances over a 5-year period. The discovery that Whitman had been conducting an organized investigation into their activities forced the family to confront the reality that their operations had attracted attention from individuals with both the capability and determination to expose their crimes. His research had identified patterns that even the family had not fully recognized, demonstrating a level of analytical sophistication that suggested formal training in investigative methods. Rebecca's psychological response to the Whitman murder revealed the first cracks in her emotional armor since childhood. The circuit rider's obvious faith and genuine commitment to serving others had affected her in ways that previous victims had not. For the first time since joining the family enterprise, she experienced what appeared to be genuine remorse about their activities, though she continued to participate in operational planning and victim processing. The family's decision to temporarily relocate their primary processing operations to a satellite facility demonstrated their recognition that the Whitman investigation might have compromised the security of their homestead. This move required extensive planning and coordination with their network managers, as well as the development of new protocols for maintaining specimen quality during extended transportation and storage periods. The elimination of potential witnesses who might have observed Whitman's activities in the region became a priority that consumed significant family resources during the winter of 1839. Thomas coordinated a systematic campaign to identify and eliminate individuals who might possess dangerous knowledge about the circuit rider's investigation or his disappearance from their territory. The spring of 1840 brought renewed scrutiny to the Grayson operation when Pennsylvania State Marshal William Bradford arrived in the region carrying official warrants to investigate the disappearance of Reverend Whitman and several other missing travelers. Unlike local law enforcement officials who had been compromised through years of systematic corruption, Bradford represented federal authority with resources and jurisdiction that extended far beyond the family's traditional sphere of influence. Bradford's investigation methodology immediately distinguished him from previous inquiries into disappearances in Grayson Hollow. Rather than focusing solely on the circumstances surrounding individual missing persons, he had developed a comprehensive approach that analyzed patterns across multiple incidents spanning nearly 2 decades. His preliminary research had identified statistical anomalies in disappearance rates that suggested systematic criminal activity rather than random frontier hazards. The Marshal's background as a former military intelligence officer had equipped him with analytical skills that proved particularly dangerous to the Grayson enterprise. He understood how to identify and exploit operational patterns that criminal organizations used to maintain security while maximizing profits. His methodical approach to evidence collection and witness interviews demonstrated a level of professional competence that the family had never previously encountered. Samuel's attempts to compromise Bradford through traditional bribery and intimidation tactics proved completely ineffective, forcing the family to confront the reality that their standard security protocols were inadequate against a determined federal investigator. The Marshal's moral integrity and professional dedication made him immune to the corruption that had protected the Graysons for nearly 2 decades. His investigation continued methodically despite increasingly desperate attempts by the family to discourage his activities. The family's decision to eliminate Bradford represented their most dangerous gamble since establishing their criminal enterprise. Murdering a federal marshal would inevitably trigger massive retaliation from authorities with resources and determination far exceeding anything they had previously faced. However, allowing Bradford to complete his investigation would certainly expose their operations and result in the destruction of their organization along with the execution of all family members. Ezekiel's psychological state during this period revealed a man struggling to maintain control over an enterprise that had grown beyond his ability to manage effectively. The stress of facing genuine law enforcement pressure for the first time had begun affecting his judgment, leading to increasingly erratic decisions that compromised operational security. His sermons became more apocalyptic in tone, and neighbors began commenting on his obvious anxiety and shortened temper. Martha's role in planning Bradford's elimination demonstrated her evolution into the family's primary strategic thinker. She recognized that killing the marshal would require unprecedented care in evidence management and witness control, as federal investigators would bring scientific methods and resources that could expose even carefully concealed crimes. Her preparation protocols for the Bradford murder included contingency plans for eliminating multiple potential witnesses and destroying physical evidence that could survive standard disposal methods. The Marshal's investigation had begun attracting attention from other law enforcement agencies and concerned citizens throughout Pennsylvania. His preliminary reports had been circulated to county sheriffs and federal officials in neighboring states, creating a network of interested parties who would immediately notice if Bradford himself disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The family's traditional methods of containing investigations through isolated murders and local corruption would be completely inadequate for managing this level of official interest. Rebecca's increasing psychological instability during the Bradford crisis revealed the long-term effects of participating in systematic murder since childhood. Her previous moral qualms about killing Reverend Whitman had evolved into more serious doubts about the family's activities, and she had begun displaying signs of what modern psychologists would recognize as severe emotional trauma. Her ability to maintain the facade of warmth and trustworthiness that made her so effective with potential victims had begun deteriorating noticeably. Thomas's surveillance of Bradford's activities provided detailed intelligence about the marshal's investigation methods and the scope of evidence he had collected. The federal officer had established a systematic approach to documenting disappearances that included precise timelines, detailed victim descriptions, and comprehensive analysis of circumstances surrounding each incident. His investigation had progressed far enough to establish clear patterns that implicated the Grayson operation specifically. If this investigation into one of America's most disturbing family criminal enterprises is keeping you on the edge of your seat, you're part of a global community of people who believe these dark chapters of history must be preserved and shared. Take a moment to let us know where you're listening from and whether you think Marshal Bradford will succeed in exposing the Grayson family's crimes. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these buried stories to light, and we read every single comment from our worldwide audience of truth seekers. The family's satellite operations had been placed under emergency protocols that effectively suspended most of their criminal activities while they focused on managing the Bradford threat. This operational shutdown cost them significant profits during what should have been their most lucrative season, but the alternative of continuing normal activities while under federal investigation would have provided Bradford with evidence that could destroy their entire network. Bradford's methodical approach to witness interviews had begun producing testimonies that corroborated his theories about systematic criminal activity in the region. Local residents who had previously been too intimidated to speak with corrupt county officials found themselves willing to share information with a federal marshal who demonstrated both competence and integrity. These testimonies provided Bradford with increasingly detailed information about suspicious activities around the Grayson homestead. The marshal's analysis of travel patterns and disappearance rates had produced statistical evidence that would be difficult for the family to explain through conventional means. His reports documented correlations between victim demographics and commercial interests that suggested profit motives rather than random violence. This analytical approach threatened to expose not only the Grayson family's activities but their entire network of satellite operations and customer relationships. The family's internal debates about responding to the Bradford investigation revealed fundamental disagreements about strategy that threatened their operational unity. Samuel continued advocating for restraint and defensive measures, while Thomas pushed for aggressive elimination of the marshal and anyone associated with his investigation. Ezekiel vacillated between these positions, his indecision contributing to growing tension within the family that compromised their ability to respond effectively to the unprecedented threat they faced. Marshal Bradford's investigation reached a critical breakthrough in late summer 1840 when he discovered the abandoned Weber wagon that the Grayson family had believed safely hidden for nearly 17 years. The deteriorated vehicle, concealed in a ravine 3 miles from the Grayson homestead, still contained personal belongings that definitively linked it to the German immigrant family whose disappearance had marked the beginning of the family's systematic murder operations. The discovery provided Bradford with physical evidence that contradicted the Grayson family's long-standing claim that the Webers had abandoned their wagon and continued their journey on foot toward Lancaster County. Hidden within the wagon's false bottom, the marshal found Heinrich Weber's carefully preserved immigration documents, family letters written in German, and most damaging, a detailed map showing the exact location of the Grayson homestead with annotations in Weber's handwriting indicating his intention to stop there for directions. Bradford's methodical examination of the wagon site revealed additional evidence that the family had overlooked during their hasty disposal of the vehicle. Fragments of clothing, personal jewelry, and children's toys scattered around the ravine provided compelling proof that the Weber family had met with violence rather than simply abandoning their possessions. Most significantly, the marshal discovered bone fragments that preliminary examination suggested were human remains from multiple individuals. The emergence of Eliza Hartwell as a key witness represented the family's worst nightmare materializing into reality. Hartwell, a former domestic servant who had worked briefly at the Grayson homestead in 1835, had fled the region after witnessing activities that convinced her the family was involved in criminal behavior. Bradford's investigation had tracked her to a settlement in Ohio, where she had married and attempted to build a new life while carrying the burden of terrible knowledge about the Grayson operations. Hartwell's testimony to Marshal Bradford provided the first detailed insider account of the family's murder methods and victim processing procedures. She described the basement facility with its specialized tables and drainage systems, the extensive collection of surgical instruments and preservation chemicals, and most chillingly, her personal observation of family members casually discussing the commercial value of human body parts during their evening meals. The former servant's account included specific details about individual murders she had witnessed or learned about during her employment with the family. Her description of Martha's sedation techniques, Rebecca's role in gaining victim trust, and Thomas's responsibilities for physical restraint and evidence disposal provided Bradford with a comprehensive understanding of how the Grayson operation functioned at an operational level. Samuel's desperate attempt to discredit Hartwell's testimony by claiming she had been dismissed for theft and moral turpitude failed to undermine her credibility with Marshal Bradford. The federal investigator recognized that her detailed knowledge of the family's methods and facilities could only have been acquired through direct observation, and her obvious emotional trauma while recounting these experiences actually enhanced rather than diminished her credibility as a witness. The family's realization that Hartwell possessed detailed knowledge of their operations and had provided this information to federal authorities triggered their most extreme security response since establishing their criminal enterprise. Ezekiel immediately dispatched Thomas to Ohio with instructions to eliminate Hartwell and her new family before they could provide additional testimony or evidence to Bradford's investigation. Thomas's mission to silence Hartwell permanently represented a dramatic escalation in the family's criminal activities, extending their violence beyond their traditional territory for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The assignment required him to travel hundreds of miles through unfamiliar territory, locate targets who were aware of the danger they faced, and execute multiple murders without triggering immediate investigation by local authorities who had no history of corruption with the Grayson organization. The psychological pressure of facing exposure had begun affecting each family member in distinct ways that compromised their operational effectiveness. Ezekiel's behavior had become increasingly erratic, alternating between periods of manic confidence and deep depression that made him unreliable for strategic planning. His sermons had devolved into rambling apocalyptic rants that made longtime congregation members uncomfortable and suspicious. Martha's response to the crisis revealed the depth of her transformation from frontier healer to systematic killer. Rather than showing concern about the moral implications of their activities being exposed, she focused exclusively on developing contingency plans for destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses. Her clinical approach to planning multiple murders demonstrated complete emotional disconnection from the human cost of their desperate attempts to avoid justice. Rebecca's psychological deterioration had accelerated dramatically since the emergence of the federal investigation. Her ability to maintain the facade of warmth and Christian virtue that made her so effective with potential victims had begun failing consistently. Neighbors had begun commenting on her obvious anxiety, and her participation in church activities had become sporadic and uncomfortable for other congregation members. Bradford's investigation had attracted support from federal authorities in Washington who recognized the potential significance of exposing a systematic murder operation that had functioned undetected for nearly 2 decades. Additional marshals and investigators were assigned to assist with evidence collection and witness protection, providing resources that made it increasingly difficult for the Grayson family to contain the investigation through their traditional methods. The marshals' communication with medical colleges and anatomical specimen dealers throughout the eastern United States had begun revealing the scope of the Grayson customer network. Several institutions admitted to purchasing specimens from Samuel Grayson over multiple years, and their records provided documentation of transactions that correlated with known disappearances in Pennsylvania. This evidence established clear financial motives for the family's criminal activities and implicated them in a commercial enterprise built on systematic murder. The family's satellite operations had begun reporting increased scrutiny from local law enforcement officials who had received inquiries from Bradford's investigation. Several network managers requested permission to cease operations entirely rather than risk exposure, effectively dismantling much of the regional infrastructure that the Graysons had spent years developing. The collapse of their extended network eliminated significant revenue streams and isolated the family from sources of intelligence about law enforcement activities. Bradford's systematic approach to documenting evidence had produced a comprehensive case file that would be difficult for corrupt officials to suppress or dismiss through traditional means. His reports had been distributed to multiple federal agencies and state authorities, creating a permanent record of the investigation that would survive even if Bradford himself were eliminated. The family's traditional methods of controlling investigations through isolated murders and local corruption had become completely inadequate for managing this level of official documentation and federal interest. Thomas's mission to eliminate Eliza Hartwell in Ohio ended in catastrophic failure when local law enforcement, alerted by Marshal Bradford's protective measures, apprehended him before he could reach his targets. The young man's arrest provided federal investigators with their first opportunity to interrogate a member of the Grayson family directly, and his psychological state after years of systematic violence made him vulnerable to questioning techniques that gradually broke down his resistance. The interrogation of Thomas Grayson revealed the full scope of the family's criminal enterprise in horrifying detail. Under pressure from experienced federal investigators who understood how to exploit the psychological fractures created by years of violence and moral corruption, Thomas began providing information about murder methods, victim selection criteria, customer networks, and operational procedures that exceeded even Marshal Bradford's most pessimistic estimates of the family's activities. Thomas's confession included specific details about individual murders that allowed investigators to correlate his testimony with documented disappearances spanning nearly 2 decades. His mechanical recitation of victim names, processing methods, and customer delivery schedules demonstrated the industrial scale of the family's operations while revealing his complete emotional disconnection from the human cost of their activities. The young man's psychological profile, as documented by federal investigators during his extended interrogation, provided disturbing insights into the effects of being raised within a systematic murder operation. Thomas displayed no capacity for empathy or moral reasoning regarding their victims, viewing them exclusively as commercial commodities whose value was determined by market demand for specific types of anatomical specimens. News of Thomas's arrest reached the Grayson homestead through their network of corrupt local officials, triggering the family's most desperate period since establishing their criminal enterprise. Ezekiel's immediate response was to begin destroying evidence that could corroborate Thomas's inevitable testimony, starting with the extensive records that documented their operations in meticulous detail. The destruction of evidence became a frantic family effort as Ezekiel, Martha, and Rebecca worked around the clock to eliminate traces of their criminal activities. They burned ledgers, correspondence with customers, victim identification materials, and operational manuals that represented nearly 2 decades of accumulated criminal knowledge. The basement facility was systematically dismantled, with specialized equipment and preservation chemicals disposed of in locations scattered throughout the region. Samuel's return from Philadelphia with news that federal investigators had begun questioning anatomical specimen dealers about their business relationships with the Grayson family confirmed their worst fears about the scope of the investigation. Several major customers had already provided testimony about their transactions with Samuel, and records from medical colleges documented purchases that correlated directly with known disappearances. The family's realization that their criminal enterprise was collapsing triggered desperate discussions about escape options that revealed fundamental disagreements about their response to the crisis. Ezekiel insisted on maintaining their position at the homestead, arguing that fleeing would confirm their guilt and eliminate any possibility of surviving the investigation. Martha advocated for immediate flight to territories beyond federal jurisdiction, while Rebecca had begun expressing desire to surrender and confess their crimes. Rebecca's psychological breakdown during this period marked the complete collapse of her ability to function within the family's criminal organization. The young woman who had spent years gaining the trust of vulnerable victims before their murders had begun experiencing what modern psychologists would recognize as severe trauma responses triggered by the prospect of facing justice for their activities. The family's attempt to maintain their facade of Christian respectability while desperately destroying evidence created increasingly obvious contradictions that aroused suspicion among their neighbors and congregation members. Ezekiel's sermons had become incoherent rants about divine judgment and persecution by evil forces, while Martha's medical practice had ceased entirely as she focused on evidence destruction. Marshal Bradford's coordinated response to Thomas's confession included simultaneous raids on known satellite operations throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. These coordinated law enforcement actions netted several network managers and recovered additional evidence that corroborated Thomas's testimony about the scope of the Grayson criminal organization. The discovery of mass graves at 3 separate satellite locations provided physical evidence that validated the most disturbing aspects of Thomas's confession. Forensic examination of these sites revealed remains from dozens of victims, processed using methods identical to those described in the young man's detailed testimony about family operational procedures. Samuel's final attempt to escape justice involved liquidating the family's accumulated wealth and attempting to flee to Canada before federal authorities could apprehend him. His capture at a border crossing provided investigators with financial records that documented the enormous profits generated by nearly 2 decades of systematic murder and commercial body trafficking. The interrogation of Samuel Grayson revealed a different psychological profile than his younger brother, demonstrating how the family's criminal activities had affected each member according to their specific roles and responsibilities. While Thomas displayed complete emotional disconnection from their victims, Samuel showed signs of moral awareness that he had systematically suppressed in order to function as the family's business representative. Samuel's testimony provided investigators with detailed information about customer networks, pricing structures, and quality control procedures that revealed the Grayson operation's evolution into a sophisticated commercial enterprise. His business correspondence with anatomical specimen dealers throughout the eastern United States documented a level of systematic criminal organization that exceeded anything previously encountered by federal law enforcement. The collapse of the Grayson network's operational security had created a cascade effect that exposed corrupt officials throughout Pennsylvania who had protected the family's activities for nearly 2 decades. County sheriffs, state investigators, and local magistrates found themselves facing federal charges for accepting bribes and suppressing investigations that could have prevented hundreds of murders. Ezekiel and Martha's final days at the homestead were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to destroy evidence while maintaining the pretense that they were innocent victims of persecution by corrupt federal authorities. Their behavior during this period revealed individuals whose psychological state had deteriorated beyond any possibility of rational decision-making or effective resistance to the inevitable collapse of their criminal enterprise. The family's systematic approach to victim selection and processing had created documentation that proved impossible to destroy completely despite their frantic efforts. Hidden caches of records, correspondence with customers, and operational manuals discovered by federal investigators provided comprehensive evidence of criminal activities that spanned nearly a quarter-century and involved hundreds of victims. The final confrontation between federal authorities and the remaining Grayson family members occurred on a fog-shrouded morning in October 1841, when Marshal Bradford led a coordinated assault on their homestead with overwhelming force designed to prevent any possibility of escape or evidence destruction. The operation involved over 30 federal marshals, state investigators, and military personnel who surrounded the property before dawn to ensure that Ezekiel and Martha could not repeat their son's attempts to flee justice. Ezekiel's response to the federal siege revealed a man whose psychological state had deteriorated beyond rational thought or effective resistance. Rather than surrendering to inevitable capture, he barricaded himself in the church he had built as cover for his criminal activities and began delivering a rambling sermon to his captors about divine judgment and persecution by satanic forces. His final public performance as a man of God provided a grotesque conclusion to nearly 2 decades of using religious authority to facilitate systematic murder. Martha's capture in the basement facility where she had processed hundreds of victims demonstrated her complete commitment to the family's criminal enterprise until the final moment. Federal investigators found her attempting to destroy the last remaining evidence of their operations, including detailed anatomical charts and preservation manuals that documented their sophisticated approach to human body trafficking. Her clinical focus on evidence destruction even while facing inevitable execution revealed the depth of her transformation from frontier healer to systematic killer. Rebecca's surrender to federal authorities marked the end of her psychological struggle between residual moral awareness and family loyalty that had tormented her throughout the final months of their criminal enterprise. The young woman who had spent years gaining the trust of vulnerable victims before their murders finally acknowledged the full extent of their activities and began providing testimony that corroborated and expanded upon her brother's confessions. The systematic search of the Grayson homestead revealed evidence that exceeded even Marshall Bradford's most pessimistic expectations about the scope of their criminal activities. Hidden chambers beneath the main house contained preservation equipment, surgical instruments, and anatomical specimens that demonstrated the industrial scale of their human processing operations. Most disturbing were the detailed records that documented not only their own victims but their coordination of satellite operations throughout multiple states. Federal investigators' discovery of the family's customer correspondence provided shocking insights into the market demand that had sustained their criminal enterprise for nearly 2 decades. Letters from medical colleges, private collectors, and research institutions throughout the eastern United States revealed a network of buyers who had knowingly or unknowingly participated in commercial transactions built on systematic murder. The interrogation of Martha Grayson proved particularly challenging for federal investigators due to her complete psychological disconnection from the moral implications of their activities. Unlike her children, who displayed various forms of emotional response to facing justice, Martha approached her questioning with the same clinical detachment she had brought to victim processing, providing detailed technical information about their methods while showing no awareness of the human cost of their operations. Rebecca's psychological evaluation by federal medical experts provided disturbing insights into the long-term effects of participating in systematic violence from childhood. Her testimony revealed the complex psychological mechanisms she had developed to maintain emotional functionality while participating in activities that violated every principle of human empathy and moral reasoning. The trial preparation process revealed the unprecedented nature of the Grayson case for the American legal system of the 1840s. Federal prosecutors faced the challenge of presenting evidence of systematic murder on a scale that exceeded anything previously encountered in American criminal history, while defense attorneys struggled to develop strategies for representing clients whose activities defied conventional understanding of criminal motivation. If you're still following this incredible investigation into one of America's most shocking family criminal enterprises, you are witnessing history being uncovered that mainstream sources have kept buried for generations. Share your thoughts about how the justice system should handle crimes of this magnitude, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest chapters of American history that others are afraid to tell. The coordination between federal authorities and international law enforcement agencies revealed that the Grayson Network's customer base had extended beyond American borders, with European collectors and research institutions having purchased specimens through intermediaries who concealed their ultimate source. This international dimension of their criminal enterprise complicated prosecution efforts while demonstrating the global scope of their commercial body trafficking operations. Evidence collected from satellite operations throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states corroborated the most disturbing aspects of the Grayson family's testimony while revealing additional victims and operational methods that even family members had not fully documented. Mass grave sites yielded remains from victims spanning nearly 3 decades, suggesting that their criminal activities had begun even earlier than investigators had initially determined. The psychological profiles developed by federal medical experts during the trial preparation process provided unprecedented insights into how systematic participation in violence affects human moral development. Each family member displayed distinct psychological adaptations to their criminal activities, with patterns that would influence criminal psychology research for generations. Martha's final attempt to justify their activities by claiming they had provided valuable services to medical research demonstrated her complete inability to comprehend the moral distinction between legitimate anatomical study and commercial murder. Her testimony during preliminary hearings revealed an individual whose capacity for moral reasoning had been so thoroughly corrupted that she genuinely believed their victims should be grateful for contributing to scientific advancement. The discovery of detailed victim selection criteria in Ezekiel's private journals revealed the calculating nature of their approach to identifying targets whose disappearance would be unlikely to trigger effective investigation. Their systematic analysis of vulnerability factors, social connections, and economic circumstances demonstrated a level of predatory sophistication that shocked even experienced law enforcement professionals. Federal investigators' analysis of the family's financial records revealed the enormous profits generated by their criminal enterprise, with annual revenues during peak years exceeding those of the largest legitimate businesses in Pennsylvania. The systematic nature of their commercial approach to murder had created wealth that allowed them to purchase protection from corrupt officials while funding the expansion of their criminal network. The preparation of evidence for the Grayson trial required federal prosecutors to develop new legal strategies for presenting crimes that challenged conventional understanding of criminal motivation and organization. The systematic nature of their activities, the commercial scale of their operations, and the multi-generational involvement of family members created unprecedented challenges for a legal system designed to address individual criminal acts rather than institutionalized murder enterprises. The trial of the Grayson family in the spring of 1842 became the most sensational criminal proceeding in American history up to that point, drawing observers from across the nation and establishing legal precedents that would influence criminal prosecution for generations. Federal prosecutors faced the unprecedented challenge of presenting evidence of systematic murder on a scale that defied conventional understanding, while defense attorneys struggled with the impossible task of humanizing clients whose activities had violated every principle of human decency. Judge Harrison Matthews, presiding over the Federal District Court in Philadelphia, recognized that the Grayson case would require exceptional procedures to manage both the complexity of evidence and the intense public interest surrounding the proceedings. The courtroom was expanded to accommodate over 300 observers, including representatives from medical colleges, law enforcement agencies, and newspaper correspondents who would carry news of the trial throughout the United States and Europe. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by federal prosecutor James Morrison, provided the first public accounting of the full scope of the Grayson criminal enterprise. Morrison's methodical presentation of evidence spanning nearly 25 years of systematic murder shocked even observers who believed they were prepared for disturbing revelations. His documentation of over 400 confirmed victims, supported by physical evidence and detailed family records, established the unprecedented nature of their criminal activities. Thomas Grayson's testimony as a prosecution witness provided the most detailed insider account of the family's operational methods ever recorded. His mechanical recitation of murder techniques, victim processing procedures, and customer delivery schedules demonstrated complete emotional disconnection from the human cost of their activities while providing prosecutors with evidence that corroborated every aspect of their case against the remaining family members. Samuel Grayson's cross-examination by defense attorneys revealed the psychological complexity of an individual who had maintained business relationships throughout the eastern United States while participating in systematic murder. His testimony about customer interactions, quality control procedures, and market development strategies provided disturbing insights into how commercial considerations had driven the family's approach to victim selection and processing. Rebecca Grayson's emotional breakdown during her testimony marked the trial's most dramatic moment, as the young woman's psychological defenses finally collapsed under the weight of acknowledging her participation in hundreds of murders. Her detailed account of gaining victim trust through feigned compassion and Christian fellowship provided the jury with devastating evidence of the family's systematic approach to manipulation and betrayal. The medical testimony presented by prosecution experts who examined the family's basement facility and processing equipment established the sophisticated nature of their human trafficking operations. Dr. William Henderson from the Philadelphia Medical College provided detailed analysis of preservation techniques, anatomical preparation methods, and surgical procedures that demonstrated knowledge rivaling formerly trained physicians. Martha Grayson's testimony in her own defense revealed an individual whose capacity for moral reasoning had been so thoroughly corrupted that she genuinely believed their activities represented legitimate commercial enterprise. Her clinical descriptions of victim processing methods and customer satisfaction procedures demonstrated complete inability to comprehend the moral distinction between human beings and commercial products. Ezekiel Grayson's final statement to the court provided a disturbing conclusion to his transformation from frontier minister to systematic killer. His rambling justification of their activities through selective biblical quotations and claims of divine mandate revealed psychological deterioration that made coherent moral reasoning impossible, while his continued attempts to portray their victims as willing contributors to scientific advancement demonstrated complete disconnection from reality. The defense strategy of claiming temporary insanity for all family members failed catastrophically when prosecution witnesses testified about the methodical planning, sophisticated operational procedures, and commercial success that characterized their criminal enterprise for nearly 2 decades. The systematic nature of their activities and their obvious capacity for concealing their crimes from law enforcement contradicted any claim of mental incompetence. The jury's deliberation lasted only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against every family member, reflecting the overwhelming nature of evidence presented during 3 weeks of testimony. The speed of their decision demonstrated that even 19th-century standards of justice found the Grayson activities so far beyond acceptable human behavior that extended consideration was unnecessary. Judge Matthews' sentencing statement provided a comprehensive condemnation of the family's activities while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of their crimes for American criminal justice. His decision to impose death sentences on Ezekiel, Martha, Samuel, and Thomas while commuting Rebecca's sentence to life imprisonment reflected recognition of her psychological victimization alongside her criminal culpability. The broader implications of the Grayson case for American society extended far beyond criminal justice to include reforms in medical education, anatomical specimen procurement, and law enforcement coordination between jurisdictions. Medical colleges throughout the eastern United States implemented new procedures for verifying the legitimate source of anatomical materials, while federal authorities developed protocols for investigating systematic criminal enterprises that crossed state boundaries. The exposure of corruption among Pennsylvania law enforcement officials who had protected the Grayson operation triggered a comprehensive reform of state and local criminal justice procedures. Over 40 officials faced federal charges for accepting bribes or suppressing investigations, while new oversight mechanisms were established to prevent future cases of systematic corruption that enabled criminal enterprises. Public reaction to the Grayson revelations included demands for legislative reforms that would strengthen federal authority to investigate crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries, while religious communities struggled to comprehend how individuals who presented themselves as devout Christians could participate in such systematic evil. The case challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and moral development that influenced American social thinking for generations. The international attention focused on the Grayson trial elevated American criminal justice procedures to unprecedented scrutiny from European legal experts who analyzed the case for insights into systematic criminal behavior and institutional responses to organized violence. The trial transcripts were translated into multiple languages and studied in legal academies throughout Europe as examples of how democratic societies could address crimes that challenged conventional understanding of human moral capacity. The legacy of the Grayson criminal enterprise extended beyond their immediate victims to include the hundreds of individuals whose remains were purchased by institutions throughout the eastern United States and Europe. Medical colleges and private collectors faced the disturbing realization that their anatomical specimens had been obtained through systematic murder, forcing comprehensive re-examination of procurement procedures and ethical standards for human tissue research. The executions of Ezekiel, Martha, Samuel, and Thomas Grayson on November 15, 1842, drew over 5,000 spectators to Philadelphia, making it the largest public execution in American history to that point. The unprecedented nature of their crimes had transformed their deaths into a national spectacle that symbolized society's rejection of systematic evil masquerading as Christian virtue. Federal authorities used the occasion to demonstrate that no criminal enterprise, regardless of its sophistication or duration, could ultimately escape justice in a democratic society committed to the rule of law. Ezekiel's final moments revealed a man whose psychological deterioration had progressed beyond any possibility of genuine repentance or moral understanding. His rambling final statement combined biblical quotations with continued justifications for their activities, demonstrating that even facing execution, he remained incapable of comprehending the moral enormity of their crimes. His death marked the end of nearly 2 decades of using religious authority to facilitate systematic murder. Martha's execution provided a disturbing conclusion to her transformation from frontier healer to systematic killer. Her final words focused entirely on technical concerns about the execution procedure rather than any acknowledgement of their victims or expression of remorse, revealing an individual whose capacity for human empathy had been so thoroughly destroyed that even imminent death could not restore normal emotional responses. Samuel's final statement represented the closest any family member came to genuine acknowledgement of their crime's moral implications. His expression of regret for the suffering they had caused suggested that his role as business representative had preserved some capacity for moral reasoning that systematic participation in violence had destroyed in other family members. His death eliminated the last witness to the full scope of their commercial network and customer relationships. Thomas's execution concluded the life of an individual whose development had been so thoroughly corrupted by childhood exposure to systematic violence that he never acquired normal capacity for moral reasoning or human empathy. His final silence reflected complete emotional disconnection from both their victims and his own impending death, demonstrating the psychological devastation that participation in family criminal enterprises could inflict on developing minds. Rebecca Grayson's life imprisonment represented a different form of justice that acknowledged her victimization alongside her criminal culpability. Her psychological evaluation during the trial had revealed the complex trauma responses that resulted from being raised within a systematic murder operation, while her eventual cooperation with authorities suggested capacity for moral development that rehabilitation might restore. The discovery of additional mass grave sites throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states continued for years after the trial, with investigators estimating that the total victim count exceeded 600 individuals spanning nearly 3 decades of criminal activity. Each new discovery reinforced the unprecedented scale of the Grayson enterprise while providing closure for families whose loved ones had vanished without explanation during the westward expansion period. The institutional reforms triggered by the Grayson revelations transformed American approaches to criminal investigation, medical education, and federal law enforcement coordination. New procedures for anatomical specimen procurement eliminated the market demand that had sustained their commercial body trafficking, while enhanced federal authority to investigate crimes crossing jurisdictional boundaries prevented future cases of systematic criminal enterprises operating with local protection. Medical colleges throughout the United States faced comprehensive investigations into their anatomical specimen procurement procedures, with several institutions discovering that significant portions of their collections had been obtained through the Grayson network. The resulting reforms established ethical standards for human tissue research that influenced medical education practices for generations while ensuring that legitimate scientific advancement could not serve as cover for systematic murder. The exposure of corruption among Pennsylvania law enforcement officials who had protected the Grayson operation resulted in the largest criminal justice reform initiative in American history to that point. Federal oversight of local law enforcement activities was expanded significantly, while new procedures for investigating systematic corruption ensured that future criminal enterprises could not purchase protection through bribery and intimidation. International attention focused on the Grayson case elevated American criminal justice procedures to unprecedented global scrutiny, with European legal experts analyzing the trial proceedings for insights into democratic societies' capacity to address systematic criminal behavior. The case became a landmark in international criminal law, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises could be successfully prosecuted through methodical investigation and comprehensive evidence collection. The psychological research conducted on surviving family members and satellite operation participants provided groundbreaking insights into how systematic participation in violence affects human moral development. These studies influenced criminal psychology for generations while establishing foundational understanding of how criminal organizations recruit and maintain participants through gradual corruption of normal moral reasoning processes. The long-term impact of the Grayson case on American society extended far beyond criminal justice reform to include fundamental changes in how communities evaluated religious authority and social respectability. The family's success in maintaining their facade of Christian virtue while operating a systematic murder enterprise challenged basic assumptions about moral character and community trust that influenced American social development throughout the 19th century. As we conclude this investigation into one of America's most disturbing family criminal enterprises, we're reminded that the darkest chapters of our history often remain hidden beneath facades of respectability and religious authority. The Grayson family's 20-year reign of terror demonstrates how systematic evil can flourish when communities fail to question authority and law enforcement succumbs to corruption. Their story serves as a permanent warning about the importance of maintaining vigilance against those who would exploit trust and faith for the most heinous purposes. What lessons do you think modern society should learn from the Grayson family's crimes? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how we can better protect vulnerable populations from systematic predators who hide behind masks of respectability. If this deep dive into America's buried criminal history has opened your eyes to the importance of preserving these dark truths, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the stories others are afraid to tell. The site of the former Grayson homestead remains empty to this day, local residents having refused to build upon ground that witnessed such systematic horror. The cemetery where hundreds of victims were secretly buried has become an unofficial memorial to those whose names were lost to history, their only monument the enduring commitment to ensure that crimes of such magnitude are never forgotten or repeated in a society dedicated to justice and human dignity.